Hello and welcome to the Clean Energy Pod powered by SSE, your guide to the people and technologies delivering the clean energy revolution. On today's episode, we hear from Ruth Herbert, CEO of the CCSA. It's the trade body for carbon capture, utilisation and storage here in the UK. One of the ways of helping reduce emissions whilst also keeping the lights on. It's an essential part of the clean energy system, but also, as we're about to hear, much more. Let's get started. Ruth, thank you very much for joining us on the Clean Energy Pod. People may have heard about carbon capture, utilisation and storage, especially if you're an energy geek and in the industry. But I'm not sure there's widespread understanding because there aren't projects you can point to and see, particularly in the UK. Do you want to start off by just explaining to people what carbon capture, utilisation and storage is and why it's important to the future energy system we have?
Yes, of course. So carbon capture is used to describe a range of technologies, but essentially what they do is they take the carbon dioxide out of flue gas or a stream of emissions from either a power or industrial plant. And then there's a process by which through compression and transportation and storage, that CO2 is taken away from that industrial or power plant and stored under the seabed in rock formations, which we call geological storage. Now, sometimes that CO2, a proportion of that can also be utilised rather than stored under the seabed, and that's utilisation. And it can be used, for example, to create CO2 heavy cement and things like that. So it is sort of permanently stored, but perhaps there's only small volumes that can be used in that way. So we still expect storage to be a large proportion of what's required. So
you're essentially taking an industrial process of some sort, whether it's either, energy production or, a big industrial user, and then you're trying to store those emissions rather than going up into the atmosphere.
Yes.
How efficiently can CCS or CCUS do that?
So there are the most advanced technologies at the moment, so sort of technology readiness levels 7 and 8, which are kind of chemical solvents, which essentially strip the CO2 out of the emissions as they pass through it, and then are sort of recirculated and recycled and used again through that process. And they can typically capture over 90%, some cases 95%. And it depends really on the type of emissions. So if you have a large industrial plant with very concentrated CO2 in their emissions, then essentially they, that can be higher rates of capture than, say, something where CO2 is only a small proportion of the overall emissions.
So it can have a significant impact then in reducing emissions, which, for anybody who's interested in climate change, is clearly something people are interested in.
Absolutely. And I think, obviously we also look at carbon removals, which is where you can capture CO2 directly from the atmosphere. So using fans, sucking the air through and then using similar processes to capture that CO2 and eventually take it away and store it as well. And so it is possible to get to net zero or even negative emissions using those technologies, obviously, combined with capture from a point source. But capture from a point source, so from an industrial facility or a power plant or a hydrogen production plant, is the most cost-effective way to tackle with emissions at source, and then using carbon removals to go further as required. But essentially, you will be getting a low carbon product at the end of that process. So if you're creating cement and putting carbon capture on that industrial process, then you will get low carbon cement at the end of that. And it will be, say, more than 90% decarbonised.
So CCS or CCUS is not clean energy, but it's low carbon energy. And that's probably an important distinction. Is that right?
Yeah. So low carbon products. And yes, if you apply that then to energy, it's low carbon power generation.
Is this new technology? Because it's not a new discussion. For full disclosure, SSE is hoping to develop some CCS plant in both England and Scotland. Has been talking about it for an awfully long time. So have other potential developers. The technology has been discussed for some time. Why hasn't it actually turned into projects yet?
So, I mean, there are kind of 40 projects operational around the world. Not all of them are the full chain of capture, transport and storage. Some are just capture and utilisation. Some are just capture and releasing it, but doing research. I think obviously in the UK, we have been on this journey for quite some time, along with other countries in Europe and the US and Australia have also been doing a lot on this. But we have sort of failed, if you like, to take that critical step of taking the technology to the large scale demonstration phase and demonstrating the full chain.
Why is that? Is that a cost issue? It's a technology issue? Policy?
It's really just policy. So, I mean, the technology has been around for many decades, so the different components. So the capture technologies, as I said, using kind of chemical solvents, those have been used in the chemicals industry for many decades. They're well understood. There are other types of capture that are coming through the ranks as well, absorbers in different types. I think the challenge has been is that there isn't the economic driver or the policy driver to put all of that together and do it at commercial scale on a large scale power industrial facility. And that's because at the moment, and it's true globally, we just don't recognise the full cost of emitting CO2. In countries where there are emissions trading schemes and or CO2 taxes, they're not really reflective of the true cost of emitting that CO2. And they're not high enough to drive investment in these kind of projects by the private sector. So the only ones that have really gone forward in the more recent phase at scale are the ones that have a lot of government funding. For example, after many years of experience with the Slightly storage site, Norway has invested in its Northern Lights facility, which will be able to take CO2 from anywhere in Europe by ship and store it again under the seabed. So that's a 80% government funded project. It's a build it and they will come type strategy. We've not really seen that anywhere else in the world yet, but we have seen things like the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, where Biden put a price on capturing and storing CO2, $85 a tonne tax credit, double that if you're going to do carbon removals directly from the atmosphere, as I talked about before. And that's essentially driving a lot of small projects to go forward and also helping to drive forward clusters of investors and infrastructure in the US. So these are the things that are catalysing, I guess, the current wave of deployment. And of course, we've got in the UK a CCUS cluster programme as well, which is really the way that I think the UK will now join the global race.
It's good, isn't it? But let me interrupt you for just 1 second. It's really important for algorithms and everything else that you can like, comment or subscribe. It's not just to feed our ego, though that helps. It's also to help broaden the reach of this podcast. It's all about everybody learning as together we try and deliver the clean energy revolution. I'll ask you about the details on the UK in a second, but just on the incentives and the funding for these projects globally. If the prize is substantially decarbonising, industrial sectors, the power system, those are major prizes which should be incentive enough for the private sector, shouldn't they? But why does government need to step in and do this?
So I think what we see with the early projects is the challenge, as much as the challenge is the economic system and not having, as I say, the full, not recognising the costs of decarbonisation in the system, meaning because we have competitive international markets, you could be undercut by someone producing the same thing not decarbonised. So things like the carbon border adjustment mechanisms and things like that are going to play a role in changing that dynamic. And
that's a way of the EU and UK equalising prices essentially, so that you're not disadvantaged if you're producing something,
exactly,
to more exacting environmental standards than somebody.
Exactly. So I think that sort of competition is always there, but I think also we're going to be creating new product standards, new product classes where, there's an opportunity to corner those markets, and actually it's differentiation. So it's a more competitive, attractive product. So I think that's, that's the size of the prize, if you like, because these are new markets, and over time, everybody will want to use low carbon cement and everybody will want to use low carbon steel, but we're not there yet. So those markets are very hard for investors at the moment to bank on. And then when you look at CCUS, because you've got the opportunity to do it as cost effectively as possible through clustering, so through bringing power, industrial, hydrogen production, carbon removals all together in a location, sharing a CO2 trunk line, for example, to an offshore store, that kind of investment is very dependent on each other. So it's almost like a coordinated final investment decisions for multiple businesses, each of whom are very used to dealing with the risks in their own sector, but not necessarily to dealing with the risks of being attached to shared infrastructure, which is also not yet built. However, there are still challenges, obviously, about how quickly I'll be able to connect to that infrastructure. Not dissimilar to what we see with offshore wind trying to connect to the electricity grid. We are going to see these CO2 networks and hydrogen networks built out rapidly, but there's still a lot of coordination needed, and it's often between sectors that aren't used to working closely together or having their strategies intertwined. There's actually quite a lot of uncertainty. All of that needs to be brought together in a coherent way.
And that's why government's so important, because it can bang heads together, but also essentially it's got to do the plumbing before businesses will invest in the various areas. Before your current job, you're a senior civil servant in looking at energy policy in the UK. Given that experience, why do you think the UK hasn't gone further?
I think a lot of this is leadership. If you look at when the first CCUS competition was cancelled, it was cancelled in a change of government under this sort of austerity policy of the time. The second competition that was cancelled, I think, was launched in 2011, cancelled in 2015. Again, change of administration. It's always easier to cut the thing for which it's very hard to fully measure the benefits in advance. But I would say that's the thing, that they are really the only things that we really want governments to invest in. So what we want when public sector capital comes forward, or when revenue support is needed, say, to top up the carbon price, which is what we're looking at for CCUS, that's because it isn't that there's a gap there. We need to prime the market because the private sector can't fully, count for all the risks and can't fully see that growth being tangible at this point in time. If they could, then we wouldn't need public money. So it's about saying to government, you can't really apply the same standards of having full confidence, for example, over the scale of low carbon product markets in the future, or the premium that they will attract. You can't know that now because nobody does. But if you want the UK to be at the forefront of that, then there is a bit of leadership, there is a bit of risk taking, which only governments can take. It's much more difficult for private capital to take that. So that really is the challenge. It's one of leadership. It's, the costs of CCUS, like any technology that is adding value, I guess, to that product, means that it's going to be more expensive than producing it producing it without CO2. Taking the CO2 away is more expensive, but the value of that product will be greater. So actually, is it a cost or is it a saving? And I think in many cases, actually, it will be a saving, because we know from the Climate Change Committee, that CCUS is part of the least cost pathway to net zero.
So there's proven technology, which is one of the criticisms of it. There's, from what you're saying, there should be a clear incentive for government policy to intervene in it. But yeah, it's been around for a while, and nothing much has really happened beyond a few examples. It's one of the reasons that essentially, unlike other technologies, offshore wind, for instance, in the power sector, where it's clean, there is this sense that actually with carbon capture, what you're doing is prolonging a fossil fuel industry rather than replacing it. And how do you respond to that criticism?
Well, I get this quite a lot, but I suppose that the first point is that CO2 capture is needed from industrial processes. So
just give us an example of what you mean by that.
So if you think about a cement plant, around half of its emissions are from the fuel it uses to create heat. And there are many ways potentially you can address that. Half of the CO2, though, that they emit is just from heating the rocks. So it's part of the process, it releases CO2.
And there's no other way of doing that.
There's no other way of capturing that CO2 apart from applying carbon capture technology. So that cement plant could effectively just capture the CO2 from its industrial process, but it can also capture the CO2 from the fuel it burns to maximise, obviously, its potential to decarbonise. And if it manages to use some biogenic fuel as well, it can use that to offset and maybe potentially go to net zero cement. Then you come to things like hydrogen production, CCS-enabled hydrogen production. So at the moment, we're producing hydrogen the normal way from natural gas, and we're emitting all that CO2. That's just happening. It's there. And the hydrogen is used for industry. Now, the very basic thing we can do to start with is to put CO2 capture onto that hydrogen production to make sure that that is decarbonised. We also have the opportunity to persuade more industries to convert to using hydrogen instead of natural gas. Now, that is not prolonging the use of natural gas, because what that does is means that industries are using hydrogen, which then over time can produce in many different ways, right? Including without fossil fuels potentially in the future. We know that there's electrolytic hydrogen, there's other ways of producing hydrogen. So what we need to do, obviously, is capture the CO2 from producing it from natural gas. If we do that, then effectively we've got a low carbon fuel in hydrogen. We're also looking at low carbon fuels for shipping and aviation. Again, so it's not prolonging, it's transitioning, and it needs to be a transition because we need to start now. If we could wait till everything was, different, unfortunately, I think we'd have already gone past the tipping point. So I think this is the challenge: is be pragmatic, deploy what you have now. And then in the power sector, if you want to get over 70% renewables, which I think most people think is realistic and possible, you need a lot of flexibility. A great deal of that will come from batteries and demand side, but some of that will need to be flexible generation. It's being designed, the contract that enables that by the government is being designed to dispatch after renewables, so not displacing renewables from the grid, but before unabated gas, so before the emitting gas.
So just
stations.
so people understand that, so in an increasingly renewable system, say it's 70% renewables, that's fantastic. Lots of people would like that. But there will be days when the sun doesn't shine, the wind doesn't blow, and therefore we need to find alternatives. And CCS, a power CCS, is one of the ways of keeping the lights, a reliable way of keeping the lights on, assuming that technology fully develops. What happens if we don't develop CCS? You've talked about the advantages. What happens if it stays, in government treacle or stuck in the mud, whatever phraseology you want to use? What happens if we don't make progress at pace?
Well, a lot of our members that are developing lots of plans for developing as much offshore wind as possible and floating and solar and other things to meet the net zero power target and the fifth and sixth carbon budget can see challenges already with what happens if you don't have that dispatchable power on the system, in terms of not getting that electricity always when you need it to where you need it and so forth. So you can already see that the system is straining. And I think the challenge, is that it will be a lot more expensive to get there, and potentially you won't be able to get all the way there in power without this. So it's a really big risk to say we're not going to develop it, because I think the system ultimately will not be able to get to as much renewables as we want. Or you're going to, as you say, you see the lights going out all the time and people are going to be unhappy that they're paying more and getting a worse service. So I think we know that we can do it and we can get there, then we need to be acting now. In terms of industry, again, I think, industrial strategy is really key here. When people are looking at their investment plans for the next 5 years, if you own a refinery or your own cement plant or any other asset, energy from waste, you're looking, say, at the 2025 to 2030 period now and saying, where should I try my decarbonisation plant of the future? Where will I put my blueprint plant, which is going to be my demonstrator in the period to 2030 of how I'm going to decarbonise my business? Do I do that in the UK? Do I do that on the continent, in the US or wherever? And for a lot of companies, it's kind of D-Day. They need to know where they're going to be able to invest in deploying these technologies at scale. And they look at the UK and they think, is it going to happen? Yeah or not? Is it going to happen on that time frame? Is it worth me putting my development money into my refinery in Scotland or my cement plant in North Wales or whatever? Is it worth doing that? Or am I better off looking at a country that is already moving ahead with its CO2 hydrogen network? Norway, Netherlands. There's lots happening in the US. A lot of our members are focused on doing the first of a kind there. So the risk is that the UK, despite having this amazing asset of a lot of disused oil and gas fields in the North Sea and the East Irish Sea.
We haven't mentioned that actually, which is people might not appreciate that, but they'll know that we've got an oil and gas industry have for decades in the UK, and that they've dug wells and extracted oil from that, which means there's lots of empty wells around our coast, which can then be filled with CO2. How big an advantage is that for us, and what's the difficulty in plumbing, where some of the industrial members you have, plumbing them into some of those wells to be utilised?
Yeah, it's a huge opportunity because we've got about a third of Europe's storage. So not only have we got plenty to store UK emissions for kind of hundreds and hundreds of years, but we've also potentially got the opportunity to help Europe decarbonise. So this is it. It's an opportunity. It's probably a responsibility as well, actually. But we've got this resource, and we need to create the policy and economic environment that enables companies to invest in developing those stores. There's a long lead-in time on those stores. It takes time because the UK regulatory framework the way it is. It takes time to get a store from initial appraisal, understanding if it's suitable for CO2 storage, through to permitting and injection, right? And we're on the cusp of getting the first 2 permits, which is really, really exciting. But yeah, there are 22 licenses issued at the moment, storage licenses, CO2 storage licenses. And those, of those, as I say, a number of them are on that pathway now to getting the CO2 storage permit, but none have been permitted yet. So we have this huge potential, and it does mean that for us, it's in the UK, it's quite easy to see how we can have stores close to our industrial heartlands all around the UK coast, and that gives confidence to British industries, but they need to see those stores moving forward through the cluster programme. Whereas if you're in Germany or somewhere else, you can see that maybe we're not going to have so much storage domestically. Maybe enough for a few years initially, but we might need to transport our CO2 elsewhere. And many industries there, and we have members that are in Germany as well, are looking at potentially shipping their CO2 to places like the UK, like Norway, maybe Denmark. And at the moment, that's all to play for. That market is emerging and it's competitive, and countries like Denmark are saying, well, Norway's ahead, but we're going to move quickly too. And they recently took some CO2 from Belgium by ship and stored it in their green sands project. So, they wanted to show that they were in this market too. So we'd really like to see the UK government obviously say, yeah, we're in this market too. But it's a huge advantage for our domestic industry in the first instance. I think that's the point to take away.
Let me interrupt for just one more second. What do you think? Give us your views. We're all learning as we go through the clean energy revolution. Leave your comments, give us a like, or share with one of your colleagues. What do you say to somebody who might be looking at this and thinking, yeah, I practically get it. We do need to do something. And no, we can't flip a switch and suddenly get to net zero. Yes, I understand we're going to need to have some transitionary technologies, but fundamentally, I just don't feel that comfortable with storing emissions under the North Sea. It just doesn't feel quite right. What would be your message to somebody who's got a practical mindset, but just there's something not quite right about this?
I mean, without wanting to give a geology lesson, it is nature's store for that CO2. It was where it was originally. So in the case of depleted oil and gas fields, of course, we've extracted that CO2 in concentrated form, which is wrapped up in the fossil fuels. And that's why when we burn them, it's emitted. So it's nature's own store for that CO2. It should be down there. That's where nature was keeping it down there until we pulled it out. So what we're doing is we're reverse processing a process that we humans created to put the CO2 back down there. It goes down there in a compressed liquid form. It is absorbed immediately by those rocks. They're like a sponge, or as a geologist I know well from the US often says, it's like putting mayonnaise on bread. It goes in, it's sucked immediately into that rock, and over time becomes part of that rock. So it is where nature keeps it, and so we should feel really that that's the right place for it to go back. And the prize is not letting it get into the atmosphere. It's not, emissions are part of life. There's really no way that can happen once it's gone into the porous rock. As I said, it's like, how could you get that mayonnaise out of the bread once you'd scraped it on? It just soaks in, right? So the store selection is key to that, right? So the regulations that we have in Europe are the best in the world on this, I believe, but they require that you select your store and you go through the store appraisal process and you make sure that the store is suitable before you start injecting at scale. So that means, typically they're around 1 kilometre below the seabed, so it's nowhere near the water. It's a porous rock, as I said, so like a sponge that will soak the CO2 up. And then it'll have a cap rock, so an impermeable rock, which is more like, I guess, the edge of your bath, like the enamel that won't let the water through. And most stores have several impermeable cap rocks above them. And, almost 1 kilometre of other rock and different things before you get to the seabed. The thing that I would, I guess, say as well is that we have a really fantastic offshore sector, as you say, and lots of skilled workers and people that have handled much more dangerous liquids like oil and gas in the offshore environment. CO2 is, I think, a lot more simple process than dealing with those. And we've got very strong regulations and capability in this country to handle it.
I shall tell in this conversation, it's sometimes a bit of a difficult sell, carbon capture. Why are you chief exec of the Carbon Capture and Storage Association? I mean, you were a senior energy official. You could be sitting quite comfortably in Whitehall, changing the policy, which we know is so important. Why did you decide to come out and into industry and get this stuff done?
Yeah, well, it was a journey for me because obviously I was changing the policy and I was involved in electricity market reform and I got a deep understanding of the challenges facing the electricity sector, the expansion of the grid, the scale up of renewables, which we managed to do through contracts for difference for renewables.
Now being copied elsewhere?
Yeah, exactly. And I think the thing about that was that model of providing long-term contracts to basically, if you like, underwrite future revenues, to take away that risk that I talked about, that government might do something and completely change the way the market works.
And people don't think about government being entrepreneurial, but this is essentially government taking a risk, which then allows a market to develop. And offshore wind's a good example of that.
Absolutely. And essentially we were trying to level the playing field for renewables, rather than, because, the issue was that natural gas plants were setting the market price and renewables were not able. They were much more expensive at that time. We knew we needed to bring them down in costs, but we knew we could only do that by deploying them at scale. Now you look at CCUS and it's the same challenge. So, when I went to set up the Low Carbon Contracts Company, which manages those contracts, we did a lot of work then looking at how could you take this CFD model and use it to get other technologies deployed at scale and to get them down the cost curve. And we started to do work on what that would look like for CCUS and hydrogen production with CCS, and dispatchable power CCS, right? And while I was in that role, that's when this opportunity came up. And for me, it was, this is the next part of the transition. This is the next difficult wedge on the CCC's, what we've got to do to get to net zero is how do we tackle industrial emissions? CCUS and hydrogen, CCS-enabled hydrogen. How do we tackle the transport sector? To some extent, we're going to need quite a lot of carbon removals, as we've seen from the CCC, repeated again last week, and, low carbon fuels. And then power. I knew from my work in the electricity sector that around 70% renewables on the grid should be achievable. To try to go beyond that gets really, really challenging, and you can't do it without dispatchable low carbon power. And at that time, we were thinking, how do we reform the whole electricity market so that it values dispatchable, flexible, low carbon power? Because we don't need the base load as much anymore with renewables, right? And this was, this is now the stuff of the reforms going on now. But, that was really fundamentally clear to me. So it made sense to me to come and try to get carbon capture and storage built, because without it, none of the work I'd done before would get us where we needed to go.
So let's imagine you're talking to your former colleagues then, given your experience now, and we've got a new government, obviously, and we've got, from a power perspective, a clean power target for 2030, which will be very ambitious. What would be your advice to both your former civil service colleagues, but also other policymakers?
Yeah, and I think also to ministers is that you've actually got to have a decision tree and you've got to get through that quite quickly. We did that on electricity market reform. There are a certain number of decisions you had to make, first and foremost, from which flowed lots of others. And I think the big decisions, one of them's already made, I guess, net zero power by 2030. We've got to do it. We want to do it as efficiently as possible, I guess. The next decision really is industrial strategy. What industries do we want to retain? What security of supply concerns do we have? What do we need to have capability for in the UK? And where are they? And what do we want to do about that? And that leads you to, okay, you definitely need CO2 and hydrogen infrastructure in those locations. Then you've got to scale up massively your ambition on CCS power, because at the moment, I think the previous government's ambition was to have one operational by 2030. You're clearly going to need a lot more than that. I mean, I think the CCC said, at least 10 gigawatts by 2030. So,
and just for context, a normal gas power plant might be a decent sized one's a gigawatt. So that's a lot of plant.
Yeah, exactly. So I think you're going to need, you'd need at least to start signing CFDs with maybe six just straight away, I would have said.
Are you knocking the door down at Desness here in London, or are you shouting, get on with it?
Yeah, well, I think what they're doing, and I'm sure what they're doing, because what I would be doing is the right thing, which is to look at the modelling. I mean, there's NESO as well, which is looking at this.
That's the electricity system operator,
and it's the new National Energy System operator now. And what's good about that is they're looking at electricity and gas systems together, and that's gas plural, so that's natural gas, hydrogen, CO2, and looking at how that fits together. What I think they also need to play into that, though, as I said, is industrial strategy. They cannot assume industrial demand will be there if we don't provide the CO2 and hydrogen networks. It won't. It will have to go elsewhere.
You've mentioned that a few times. How worried are you that the kind of pause in actual action will actually have an impact on jobs? And
we are seeing refineries, steel plants close, refineries close. We are seeing the impact that uncertainty can have. Uncertainty on the transition, how it applies to businesses, is really problematic. And most of our members in that space, they don't want obligations unless they've got solutions, right? But they are more than happy to embrace those solutions if the government can give them clarity on when they get access to them. So they want to have CCUS. They want to use their UK assets as a front runner for what they might do globally with their assets. And we have the opportunity to do that and export that know-how and skill and capability as well. But they need kind of certainty on it, really. And we've not got that now. We've not got that kind of planned network growth. So I think that's something that NESO can hopefully help with, but it's beyond just power. And that's my point. And it's beyond just energy, but it's also thinking about industrial requirements.
So it's not just about emissions, it's also about jobs.
Yeah, I think it's strategic as well as to, what low carbon product markets does the UK want to corner? There's an opportunity here actually to rewrite, the last 200 years in a way, the industrial revolution, everything else, that industrial decline. Well, now there's going to be a kind of whole new markets to play for. So we might have seen things steadily be offshored, but they don't have to be. If we want to increase the competitiveness of our industry and be known for certain low carbon products in the UK, like sustainable aviation fuel or low carbon cement and others, we have the opportunity now to make that investment in the net zero industries of the future. And I feel that fits really, really well with the National Wealth Fund, the industrial strategy of the new government. But civil servants will be trying to work out, okay, where's the lowest hanging fruit? What are the sort of things that we should just get on with straight away that are really, really clear? And I think the cluster program, which is already there, the business models which are already developed, all of the legislation which passed in the Energy Act last year is a real gift to the new government because they have all the powers, that there's a budget already allocated. It might not be enough, but it can allocate what's there, look at what else is needed in the CSR. And I think is a great opportunity to do something very quickly. And there's about 30 billion in our members and their investors that would like to invest in the UK. By 2030, if we went as fast as we could, there are obviously things that could slow that down. But I think, there is a prize there if the government wants to take it.
And it sounds like a big prize. Ruth, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for joining us. That's all we have time for on this episode. But if you found anything in it valuable, please like, comment, or subscribe. Or even better, share with one of your colleagues or friends. See you soon.